Stephen Ellis talked about the rainy season and wrote about it. We co-organized with the Netherlands African Business Council both a magazine and a conference called Africa Works. The first thing I think you should know about Africa is its population explosion. In the year 1650, Europe and Africa both had 100 million inhabitants, and each of them had 17% of world population. In the year 1900, Europe's population had exploded to a level of more or less 650 million. Africa had experienced centuries of misery and slavery, and Africa's population was still 100 million. Look what happened in the last 110 years. Africa's population truly exploded to more than 1 billion in just 100 years, 10 times or more. Europe's population stabilized, little growth, and in the year 2050, the expectations are that Africa will grow, Africa's population will grow to a level of 2 billion, while Europe will just grow a little bit more. In percentages, that's also very telling. Africa in the year 2050 probably has the same number of inhabitants, or almost the same level, as Europe at its peak. There's another thing happening, that's called urban explosion. In 1960, when so many African countries became independent, there were only 65 million urban Africans. Only about 20% of the continent's population. Currently, there are more than 450 million. It's now 42%, and demographers think it will soon be 50% or more. Can you imagine, in just 50 years, from 65 million urban people to now close to 500 million? What that means for countries, how to manage that? And there are already 4 mega super cities in Africa. Normally people think about super cities if they talk about Asia or if they talk about Latin America. There are currently 4 big cities with more than 10 million people. Do you know which ones they are? There's Cairo, there is Johannesburg and surroundings, there's Lagos, and the 4th one hardly anyone realizes. It's Kinshasa. Huge, huge cities. Already 55 cities in Africa have more than 1 million inhabitants. And Africa has the youngest population on Earth. An average African is 20 years of age, which also means a lot of creativity and a lot of youthful energy. That's all Africa now. There's a lot of attention for the growth of the African middle class, particularly after the year 2000. According to a Polish source, and there is a very good Polish African Studies Center now, so you can also see that as a new thing happening in the world. According to them, the number of middle-class people in Africa has really risen a lot, to now almost 35% of Africa's population. Of course, it depends how you define it. With that growth of an urban population comes a growth of demand for Africa's own agricultural production. And agricultural production now, per person, is higher than it used to be in 1960. It's not that there's more hunger in Africa on average now than in 1960. The situation is better. And with a population growth in 50 years' time of 350%, 3.5 times more people in 50 years, the agricultural land expanded with more than 200%. but also the yields improved to almost twice the level in 1960. It's not yet a big green revolution, but it's coming. And the agricultural breakthroughs, both in crop production and in livestock production, are really clear to see if you study the figures and also go to the field in Africa. You can see that things are changing. And it mainly happens after 2000. Let me briefly tell you a bit about social trends. Africans now are much healthier than 20, 30, 40 years ago. Life expectancy is much higher, despite HIV/AIDS. Of course, that's a problem. But life expectancy has risen with more than 20 years on average. People are much better educated now than they used to be. The literacy rates of adults are much higher, much bigger. Much more people who can read and write. Many more and a much higher percentage of children go to primary and secondary schools. And there is a very, very rapid growth of the number of students in Africa. In fact, the fastest growth of university populations anywhere in the world. And of course, communication is exploding. This is that famous Facebook map that many of you will know. This is the users of Facebook a few years ago. And you can see that although major parts of Africa are pretty dark, there's also a lot of light there. And look at Nigeria, look at East Africa, look at South Africa, look at Northern Africa. It's coming. If you look at the faces, the 1960s were doing pretty well in Africa. The 1970s were a disaster. The 1980s, a lot of stagnation, a lot of problems. And then, slowly by slowly, in the 1990s, recovery. In the 2000s, rapid growth. Partly because of the demand coming from countries like China. Demand for Africa's resources. And the last 10 years, there were 6 African countries among the 10 with the highest economic growth on earth. And people expect that to increase even in the next 10 years. The political and cultural situation is confusing, but compared to 1990, there are many more democratic regimes, more freedom of expression, far more exposure to the outside world. Many more Africans speak international global languages. And good governance, it's not so nice yet, but it's also not as gloomy as it used to be. And in religious terms, there is massive expansion and a major struggle going on between more strict and more mystic or spiritual or hybrid or breakaway interpretations of both Islam and Christianity. And of course, that gives a lot of tensions, but some of these tensions are and can be very productive. But it's not all nice. There are many, many challenges. There's fast economic growth, yes, and it will continue. But there's also a major growth of economic inequality. There is huge unemployment, particularly for the youth of Africa. And there's growing anger. You can feel it if you come to Africa again and again like I do. We want it too, and we want it fast. And of course, that comes with a bit of violence, or a lot of violence in some places. There is competition between the world powers for Africa's resources. There are major environmental challenges, and there is a strong need for good leadership, both at world level with regard to Africa, but also at the level of the African Union, at country levels, at city levels, and at more local levels. And we have to see, we have to acknowledge that there's still some regimes you can call kleptocracies, greedy people in charge. who do not care about the normal people, but care about themselves. And of course, that gives a lot of popular resistance, a lot of criminal violence, a lot of civil war, a lot of frustration-based outmigration. That's also Africa. And I am an Afro-optimist. And I hope you will also be an Afro-optimist. But don't look away from what also happens and what is really a challenge. That's what I wanted to show you. Okay, so we need you. We need world leadership. We need world leadership to stimulate and facilitate inclusive and sustainable development in Africa. We need world leadership. Where is it? We need world leadership to assist Africa's political, economic, and cultural leaders to go beyond greed and to go beyond violence and to collaborate for a fair distribution of opportunities on a world scale and within Africa. And the challenge is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dietz, for your stimulating and very inspiring words. I now ask that the members of the corps diplomatique that they leave the theater to prepare for the flag parade. One more time, I kindly request that the members of the corps diplomatique you leave the theater to join the student ambassador and the national flag of your countries, which are represented outside. So can we have all members of the École Diplomatique representing countries A to K, that is Afghanistan through Kyrgyzstan, to please leave through the right-hand side. And then can all members of the École Diplomatique that represent countries from L to Z, that's Laos through and including Zimbabwe, to please leave through the left-hand side. Thank you.
That was the house. Really one. That's way too.
Can the House please come to order? Thank you. And now it is my great honor to introduce this year's Secretary General, Ms. Sarah Garrett. Madam Secretary General, you have
the floor. Your Excellencies, esteemed guests, fellow student officers, dear delegates. Sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great. We can be that generation. Us playing small does not serve the world. Who are we not to be great? These are the words of the late Nelson Mandela, an African leader that is incomparable in his struggles and ultimately his successes. It is my utmost honor to be here, serving as the Secretary General of the 46th Annual The Hague International Mall of the United Nations. Year after year, THIMUN cements the importance of youth and the significance of tapping into the thousands of creative and innovative minds that are present at this conference, as we have the potential to be great. It highlights the importance of the involvement of the youth and their determination to learn about and solve some of the world's largest issues, hoping to leave a path that will help the world be a better place. I urge you all to take the role you've been granted seriously. Many don't get the opportunity to instigate change or have a positive impact as we do now. We are now in a position to develop solutions for problems that plague our world constantly. It is nothing new that the world we live in now is becoming more interconnected by the second. Whatever happens in one area of the world is always capable of affecting other areas, which is why it is important for us to take responsibility of our actions and make fully informed decisions. And I am sure that I will see this reflected in the solutions proposed. Model United Nations allows us to be able to expand our horizons from such an early age. When we are exposed to these problems and we have to think and collaborate to come up with solutions, we are building a much better future, not only for ourselves, but for generations to come. Do not doubt yourselves and the power you can hold. We are the future of the international community, and events like THIMUN allow us to truly understand the power that we hold. The power to make the world better, the power to advocate human rights, and the power to achieve great things. The theme for this year, Africa, Transformations and Challenges Ahead, is not only one that is of the utmost importance, but it is also one that I hold dear to my heart. I am a proud Egyptian, and as all of you know, my country has been facing a hard time for the past few years, politically, economically, and socially, and that reflects what has been happening in Africa. In 2013, the Al-Qaeda rebels in Mali and the Seleka rebels in the Central African Republic set the tone for the year. Conflict, and a lot of it. South Sudan seemed impressive as Africa's newest nation, and gave leaders a lot of hope. But as 2013 turned to a close, fighting broke out in the capital that sent worrying signs of a political turned ethnic struggle. We could also see the presence of conflict in the midst of development. Kenya suffered the Westgate siege that lasted for 4 days and led to the death of 67 people, serving as a reminder that even prosperity came with perils. Nigeria, one of the world's fastest growing economies and predicted to overtake South Africa as the biggest economy in Africa, still suffers from the Boko Haram's actions. However, this does not mean that Africa is poor, and it does not mean that we are here to save it. It is true that Africa has many challenges ahead of it. However, looking back, the average lifespan for women in sub-Saharan Africa has increased by 16 years since 1960. The percentage of children who are in school has almost doubled since 1970. Since 2001, Africa's GDP has expanded more quickly each year than the global average. Countries such as Ghana, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone all have extremely high rates of economic growth. Many of the world's top 10 fastest growing economies, as Mr. Ton Dietz said, are in Africa. There is now enough momentum for Africa to grow exponentially in 2014 and beyond, faster than any other region in the world. As we debate here for the next week, we need to keep in mind that we need to think globally. Let's not simply isolate the African continent, as we tend to do, and ignore its placement in the world. The solutions we come up with here will not only help Africa, but it will improve the global economy and diplomatic relations between African and non-African nations. As I mentioned before, nations are not isolated. What happens in one area of the world will ultimately have an effect on all other nations. Keep this in mind when you are dealing with the issues at hand. Keep in mind how Nelson Mandela, an African leader who faced countless obstacles in his lifetime, was, and remains to be, a global inspiration. Much like how what happens in Africa has an effect on all of us, no matter where we come from, and no matter where we go to when this week is over. Let us not dwell on problems. Here at THIMUN, we have the ability to continue the positive process to change. We might feel like we are too young, too inexperienced, too naive. However, we are not. We can be great, and we have the power to make changes in the world. If we do not start now, then who will? And if we do not start now, then when will we start? And if we do not do it, then who will? I invite you all to join me on the path to change, the path to transform Africa to what it truly can be, the path that can lead it to greatness. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Madam Secretary General. And now it is my pleasure to announce the charity being supported this year at THIMUN 2014, which is the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, with a special emphasis on the refugees in the Central African Republic. Throughout the week, I ask that in addition to working hard to come up with solutions within your committees, that you also embrace this charitable spirit in other ways, and if possible at all, to donate to this truly exceptional cause, as our support is very much needed. Thank you. I'm now welcoming back to the stage our musicians from the British School of the Netherlands. Give them a warm welcome. Thank you.